Hi, Kevin. Thanks for coming. Let's come to the first question. Could you introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks for having me. I'm Kevin McCain, professor of philosophy and chair of the Department of Philosophy at the University of Alabama at Birmingham.
Okay, that was quick.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, then we can come directly to the substantial things.
Okay.
We want to talk about evidentialism. And first of all, of course, what is evidence?
Yeah, good. That's seems like it as an evidentialist should have a clear answer about this, right? Um, there's different senses that we might mean by evidence, right? So often we'll use the term evidence. You might see it in, say, a court of law, where someone will refer to a physical object as evidence, right? So the um, the murder weapon is evidence that this person is guilty. That's a a perfectly reasonable way to use the term evidence. But typically, when evidentialists are talking about it, we're talking about epistemology. So we're interested in what makes our beliefs rational or reasonable or knowledge and so on. And so in that sense, we're interested in evidence in terms of justifying evidence. So in that case, evidence will be things that I or you or any other agent has to go on in forming our beliefs and other doxastic attitudes. And so evidence in that sense is um, the sorts of things that allow me to have justified doxastic attitudes. Now, there's a lot of debates about, what counts as evidence. There's debates about the ontology of evidence in terms of some people think of evidence in this justifying sense as propositions, and that you have those propositions as evidence in certain ways. I actually think that's a mistake. Um, Evidence consists of mental states that can be described as propositions and maybe have propositional content, but it's the mental states themselves that are evidence. So, for example, if, say, you currently rationally believe that you feel warm, like the temperature feels warm, presumably a significant part of your evidence for that is your current mental state of having the sensation of feeling warm. Uh, the same sort of thing when it comes to, my belief that I'm looking at a computer screen right now. Part of my evidence for that is my current visual experience. That experience is evidence. And so, like I said, that's more controversial to say that it's the mental states, but in general, evidence is the sorts of things that we have to go on in justifying our beliefs or making rational our doxastic attitudes.
You wrote a book about evidentialism, and we
Yes.
want to talk about it. So, what is evidentialism in general?
Yeah, so evidentialism in general is kind of a name for a broad sort of category of theories in epistemology. In broadest sense, evidentialism is the idea that um, what's justified for you or reasonable or rational, depending on which sort of epistemic good you're after, is determined by the evidence that you have. And so evidentialists will typically say what makes a view an evidentialist view is you'll say, so like the kind of classic evidentialists will say whether a particular doxastic attitude, uh, so belief, disbelief, suspension of judgment, some degree of belief, whatever, whether that is rational for you to have or justified for you to have at a particular time is determined by the evidence you have at that time. So if your evidence sufficiently supports the truth of some proposition, then believing that proposition is justified for you. If it doesn't, then it's not justified. It might be that uh, you should actually believe that the proposition is false because your evidence supports that, or it could be that your evidence is more balanced and you should withhold judgment. But the key idea in evidentialism is that the reasonable thing when it comes to our doxastic attitudes, so our beliefs, our disbeliefs, our suspensions of judgment, the reasonable thing there is determined by the evidence.
That does not sound very controversial to me. Yeah, but I know that you wrote about criticism on evidentialism. So, what is the biggest or most popular criticism you can notice?
Great. Yeah, and I'm very glad you had that response, Nika, because that is my response too. It's like this seems like an obvious view. And so the two probably most prominent evidentialists, Rich Feldman and Earl Connie, when they wrote their canonical paper in 1985 called Evidentialism, just said, they even start out by saying something like the following, roughly, we thought, evidentialism is just obviously true and everyone knows this. And then we were surprised that contemporary epistemologists were saying things that conflicted with it, right? So I do think there is this pool that evidentialism seems like kind of the commonsensical view. Like, of course, you believe what your evidence supports, especially once we understand evidence broadly. So sometimes you'll get objections where people don't understand what the evidentialist is talking about when in terms of evidence. So they'll say something like, evidentialism is false because, say, the average person is perfectly justified in believing that they see a tree, but they don't have, say, scientific evidence about that this thing is a tree. They haven't tested it, or they don't really have complex theories of evidence. But that's not what evidentialists are claiming, right? So if you understand evidence to be in terms of your mental states, or like I do, as ultimately depending on certain sorts of experiences you have, um, then it's very plausible that ordinary believers have these experiences. They have good evidence. They're justified. Some of the objections that you'll get to evidentialism. One is sometimes people will worry about what's sometimes called the problem of forgotten evidence. And so they'll say, imagine a case where you, in the past, learned something. I think a classic example that Alvin Goldman gave was, you read something that eating broccoli was healthy for you. And it's a reputable source. You read it, um, and you learned that eating broccoli was healthy for you. You read it from a reputable source. I read it from a disreputable source. But we both form the belief. You form a justified belief. I form an unjustified belief. But later, we've both totally forgotten our initial evidence for it.
Mm-hmm.
Goldman says, well, years later, when we've totally forgotten this and we both have the belief, your belief is still justified, mine is unjustified. And he wants to say this is a problem for the evidentialist because he'll say, well, you have forgotten your evidence. You have a justified belief, but it's not based on any evidence. Of course, the problem with this is it's not clear that you don't have evidence for this, right? Because even if you've forgotten where you initially learned it, presumably in the intervening time, you've either learned other things that support it, you have other beliefs that it fits with, so on. So that's kind of one objection. Sometimes people have this forgotten evidence objection. Sometimes people will object to evidentialism on the grounds that it doesn't say enough about inquiry. And so people will worry about cases where this is a one where people will say, what if you have some evidence, right? You're aware of some things, you have some evidence for believing P, but like all you have to do is look, right beside you at the table, and you will have definitive evidence regarding P or not P, but you just don't do it. So some people say in that case, you're not justified in believing P because they'll want to say something like, well, there's this evidence that you should have had or could have easily had, and it makes a difference. Again, this is something where an evidentialist will often respond by saying, well, there's a difference in saying, what might make me a good epistemic agent or a good inquirer, and maybe I'm criticizable for being lazy and not just looking and getting this better evidence. But when it comes to justification or what's rational to believe, we're only looking at the evidence I have. And as long as I'm doing well with that, then I'm doing well.
So my next question is something about mentalist internalism. Yeah, and you developed your account on grounds of Feldman and Coney.
And Connie, yep.
Connie. Yeah, what is this mentalist internalism and what was their account? And
good, yeah. And so this is part of the idea of what's counting as evidence, right? So a mentalist, they could be an evidentialist. Maybe there's some other sort. I think really any view that's actually mentalist in the internalist sense will count as an evidentialist for the most part, theory. Mentalism is just committed to the idea that mental duplicates are also duplicates when it comes to justification. So in other words, anyone, if there were another person, like a possible person, who has all of the same mental states and processes that you currently do right now. So like they are your mental duplicate. Then the mentalism is committed to saying that then you and that person are alike when it comes to everything that's justified or unjustified for you, right? If you're justified in believing that, you're having a conversation about evidentialism right now, they're equally justified because they have all of the same mental states as you. Now, why that's important and what will make that an internalist view is on this sort of view, you and what we'll sometimes refer to as your demon world counterpart. So we imagine someone who's exactly like you, but they're really in some skeptical scenario. So they're deceived by Descartes' demon, or say this person is actually in a computer simulation and they don't know it, and they're being fed all the same information as you. The mentalist will say you and that person are equally justified, even though most of your beliefs are true and most of their beliefs are false, but you're still equally justified because what makes the difference is the mental states, right? So if they're mentally alike, um, they're going to be justificationally alike, and so that's kind of an internalist mentalism. Now we distinguish that, right, because you might be a mentalist. So technically, Timothy Williamson and some of the knowledge first crowd are mentalists because Williamson says knowledge is a mental state. And on his view, all evidence is knowledge, and all knowledge is evidence. So E equals K. So on his view, um, it's mentalist in the sense that it's mental states that do all the justifying, but it's not the same sort because on his view, you and your demon world counterpart actually don't have the same mental states because you know stuff and they don't. And right, knowledge is a different mental state. And so his view is going to be committed. So the knowledge first view is going to be committed to saying you um, are rational in believing things about the world around you, but maybe your demon world counterpart isn't. And so the internalist is going to deny that. They're going to say, no, look, if everything in terms of all of your mental states, that the ones that are accessible, right? So that's where we got to be careful, right? I'm doubtful that knowledge is a mental state. I think that's kind of strange in general, but uh, so the internalists will say, well, let's talk about your ones that aren't factive, so not like knowledge, if knowledge is one. So whatever mental states that you could share with this deceived counterpart, that's what the internalist mentalists are going to say is your evidence. And so Connie and Feldman's view is um, that's what's going to make someone justified. So your belief or your disbelief or whatever, to talk with belief because it's easier to keep track of, but a belief is justified if and only if the truth of the proposition believed fits the evidence you have, where evidence consists of these mental states.
So yeah, let's come to the last question.
Sure. Yeah.
Where's the debate now, and
Hmm.
which questions are open for discussion?
I would like to be able to say that the debate is closed now and everyone has accepted what I've been saying for the past decade or so, and we're finished. But that would be false. So a lot of the debate's still open. So um, there's still a lot of debate and open questions about. So even that initial thing I mentioned about the ontology of evidence, should we think of it as propositions or should we think of it as mental states? There's still debate about that. Um, there's debate about, and then even amongst those who say take it to be propositional, there are debates among those who say, well, only true propositions can be evidence, and others who say, no, actually, you can have false propositions as evidence. So there's debate there. There's debate on what it takes to possess evidence, because sometimes people will want to say, um, there's actually, kind of a difficult question of when do you have something as evidence or not? So in the past, Rich Feldman defended a very restrictive view of this, where he said only things you're currently aware of or currently thinking are evidence, which is very restrictive. Um, I think he may have eased back on this now, but then you either say something like that that's very restrictive, or you say something that's overly permissive, where you just say, well, any of your mental states are evidence, even if you couldn't remember them ever. And that seems bad. But where most of the real work is, I think, in the middle of like, okay, where's the line? When do you have something as evidence? When do you don't? And that's pretty tricky. And there's still debate on evidential support, on what it actually takes for evidence to support something else. So oddly enough, there are people who are skeptical of my sort of explanationist take still, who think that maybe it's not just explanatory relations. So there's a lot of debate there. One area that I see that this is just kind of my own self, and I've started to, I think, bug people enough about it to where other people are starting to maybe write a little bit more about it, is um, an area in terms of appreciating the evidence. So what does it take to appreciate what your evidence supports? And what role does this have? And so there's debate there. So Connie and Feldman seem to think that uh, in order for you to even have something as supporting evidence for a belief, you have to appreciate the connections. Whereas I think that you don't. So Scott Stapleford and I have written some things on this, arguing that no, actually, if you just have the mental states, they are evidence. You might need appreciation. I think some things I've written on my own are that in order to move from merely having evidence for something to actually believing in a justified way, you might need this sort of appreciation to bridge the gap. But I think that's a live question. There's a lot of work to be done still on what exactly appreciation is, how exactly does it work, and so on. So anyway, that's just a few. There's a whole lot of things to still work on evidentially.
Okay. Yeah. It's an interesting field.
Yeah, there's a lot to do. Yeah.
Good for us, the newcomers.
Yes, exactly.
So yeah, I can just thank you again for taking your time. I think it was very fun and interesting.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. These are great questions. A lot of, as you can tell, a lot of things to think about.